Recording in progress.
Where did he go? He's in the office, so you tell him it's recording in a second. Okay, welcome everybody. In case you can't tell, this meeting is being recorded. It's also being broadcast over Zoom, so everyone knows what's going on. My name is Leslie Kaplan, and I'm the chair of the Town of Somerset Communications Committee. And this is the first of what we hope will be a long series of town talks. Talks from Somerset residents or former Somerset residents on their areas of expertise that we think would be of interest to their neighbors and fellow residents. I ask you please to turn your cell phones off or to silent. And I think John Barry is going to do the introduction. Let's speak with him.
I don't need to introduce Norm here because everyone knows his record and his expertise. But I want to tell you a short anecdote, which illustrates something about Norm you may not have known. I have back in England a small tribe of great nephews. Hard to believe with one so young, but it's true. And one of them, Joe, decided in what amounts to his junior year at college that he would come and study in the US. And so he came to University of Nebraska in Omaha and studied for a whole year and fell in love with the minutiae of American electoral politics. And so when he was coming back through Washington to go home, we said, you know, you want to meet Norm Ornstein. And so Norm was delighted. So we set up a dinner. And within sort of 2 minutes, it was clear that they formed a sort of love bond, because what happened was that the conversation was completely incomprehensible. One of them would say something like that, you know, the Colorado 9th district, and the other one would say, yes, but of course there's been demographic changes. They're completely incomprehensible. But after about an hour of this, we brought it to a halt. And but what Norm then said, Norman enjoyed talking to someone who was started out down the same path that he's followed in his career. And so Norm said to Joe, you know, if you want an internship anywhere, I can help you. That's Norm. He's passionate about his discipline and his expertise, but he's very good at helping kids who want to start out on the same road. So, Norm, with that introduction, Norm.
Thank you, John. For those of you who don't know, we moved here in late 1982, right before our second son, Danny, was in a house on Surrey Street that my father-in-law built, which is now occupied by my cousin, who had been envious of us and wanted her kids to be able to go to Somerset School. So we still have our ties here. And of course, we have ties with lots of people who are here. I do see Blair Levin is here, but his wife Patty is not, because she had Torah study tonight. And I thought that's actually appropriate. We should all be praying really seriously. I will say I was struck this last week when I saw something that's become, I think, the credo of our times, which is never criticize anybody until you've walked a mile in their shoes. That way you'll be a mile away from them and you'll have their shoes. So let me just talk a little bit about where we are and how we got here. And I will say at the outset that we're not in a good place, as you all know, and I fear it will get worse. We're not in a good place, and I fear it will get worse, unlike Jeffrey, who is an optimist, because, and I just finished a piece with Dahlia Lithwick, who's one of our great legal commentators, that there's a natural assumption that the system will hold, that we have endured for almost 250 years, that the checks and balances will work. But just basically taking the leap of faith that because they've held in the past, they will hold this time. is not anything that I can embrace right at the moment. And if you look just at the last couple of days, the Supreme Court, which we will see within the next few days, will have some of the most critical rulings. One of them on the abortion pill mifepristone, which is very possibly going to be curtailed in its use. The most likely outcome is that the Supreme Court is going to say that we want to take it back to before the FDA allowed it to be done without prescription and via mail. Even though we have 20+ years of data showing that it's perfectly safe, but it will make it even more difficult for women's health and for women around the country. And in particular, it will really tighten the screws in red states. But more significantly, of course, is the ruling on immunity for the president. And there, what we know is that the absurd notion, which was pointed out in the DC Circuit when this case came up, that a president has absolute immunity for official acts. And we had Judge Pan, who said to the people pushing this argument, so that means that if a president called up SEAL Team 6 and said, assassinate my rivals, that would have immunity. And we probably have 2 Supreme Court justices who will say that that's okay. But more than that, the DC Circuit took a lot of time on this particular case. And they took that time because they wanted to do a decision that was so ironclad and so thorough that the Supreme Court would not need to take it up again. But they took it up and they have delayed it, and it's going to be delayed again until we're past the election. So the case involving Trump's culpability in the insurrection is likely to go by the boards until next year. But what we also know from the Supreme Court is that this week, Clarence Thomas, yet again, for the 3rd time, said, oops, I had gifts and trips and I forgot to declare them, which is a violation of the law. The law requires disclosure of gifts for all federal officials, including Supreme Court justices. He did this 10 years ago for millions of dollars of gifts and then had to revise his disclosure forms. It's not like he doesn't know what's supposed to happen. And here we have 2 more lavish trips, including one to Bali. These are worth huge sums of money. And it's pretty clear that there's utter corruption there. And then along with that, of course, a wife who we know from emails and from testimony up to her neck in planning the insurrection on January 6th and supporting it, has not recused from any of the decisions where his wife is actually potentially culpable and involved. We have Sam Alito, who now, it is clear, lied to Congress and in public about the flag posted outside his house. But now, if you haven't seen or heard the tape of him basically saying that we're in a war and there are 2 sides and we have to win in the polarized society, and we're going to have more coming out from his wife tomorrow. This was something at the Supreme Court Historical Society meeting where somebody taped discussions with the 2 of them, indicating that she was also deeply involved in the insurrection and refusing to recuse on these issues. So the idea that the court system is going to protect us is much shakier than it was even in 2020, when, at least in one case, the Supreme Court drew a line, and we had 60 other cases where courts drew a line. But it's not clear that they're going to draw a line the second time around. Now, we could say, well, we have the Congress. The Congress is the check and balance. They have greater power. This week, the Speaker of the House made 2 appointments to the House Intelligence Committee. The intelligence committees in the House and Senate have members who have access to the most sensitive secrets that the society and the government has. And it's always been the case that the leaders who pick members for that committee pick the most responsible people, the ones who you can trust, the ones who have some depth and understanding. And there were a couple of people, including one with a lot of experience in intelligence work, who were there, Republicans, to be put on the committee. And Mike Johnson, the speaker, instead picked one, Scott Perry, who himself was so deeply involved in the planning for January 6th that the FBI seized his phone and he's suing the FBI. And now he's going to have access to information to be able to blackmail the FBI or try and intimidate them to drop any consideration of doing anything about it. And the second is Ronnie Jackson. Now, that may be a name familiar to even those who don't follow this stuff very closely. He was the White House physician and a Navy commander who first was demoted because he was an alcoholic and a drug abuser who also abused his staff, sexual misconduct, and who, of course, was a pill pusher while the president's physician, giving all kinds of goodies, which they were not supposed to have, and now is a member of Congress and is very much over on the right-wing fringe. These are the last people you'd want on the Intelligence Committee. And why did he do this? As he told his colleagues, including the ones he did not pick, who should have been picked, Donald Trump told me to make these appointments. If you're going to do that, and of course, part of the reason why Trump wanted these people there is that now that he is a convicted felon, he is not eligible to get the kinds of briefings as a presidential candidate that you would normally get, where you have access to that intelligence information. And of course, this is also somebody who, in the biggest case against him, which is the case in Florida, where he walked away with tons of top secret information. We know he shared particularly sensitive secrets with an Australian businessman who had no right to have access to that information. And they just discovered more documents that after months of negotiating with the National Archives, where they tried all the usual means to get those documents back, when Mike Pence and Joe Biden discovered classified documents, they didn't negotiate, they just notified authorities and turned them in. And of course, that trial now on hold because of Judge Aileen Cannon. So they're going to share this information with Donald Trump. We cannot trust the judiciary at almost any level. And now we have another interesting example with Aileen Cannon. Number of courts, including appeals courts, have said that the regulations involving the creation of independent counsels is perfectly constitutional. And Cannon has decided to hold hearings and delay any of the other proceedings in this case in Florida, including in an unprecedented way, bringing in people who had no relation to the case, who filed amicus briefs, to appear and argue in front of her court on whether Jack Smith, the independent counsel, has been appointed constitutionally. Whatever she decides, it's very possible that that case will get to the Supreme Court. And we know that Clarence Thomas has already made it clear that he will vote that these independent counsels are unconstitutional. So we've got all kinds of reasons to believe that the judicial system will not hold, that Congress is not going to be there to provide the backstop that we need if we end up moving, and the possibility of moving towards an autocracy. We also know now this week where we have had states that are bringing cases against those who created false electors and tried to push this forward. In Wisconsin, we now have ironclad evidence from texts and other communications that Ron Johnson, the senator from Wisconsin, who had denied that he had brought the Wisconsin fake electors on January 6th to try and delay the certification of the president, that he in fact did so and knowingly did so. And we'll see we'll see if the Justice Department, which has brought no cases against members of Congress in the House or Senate for what they did involving January 6th, will move to take some action. And of course, Clarence Thomas has violated the law. And we've had lots of people in government, some we may even know, who did not declare gifts that they had gotten from outsiders, who were prosecuted for it. But we're not likely to see those prosecutions. And that means we've lost another bit of capacity for having the backstop. Then we have the free press, which has always been a bulwark. We have the Washington Post, Democracy Dies in Darkness, and the New York Times, which are our basic opinion leaders. And then we have, of course, all of the other media. If you watched this week any of Donald Trump's appearance in Las Vegas, it was bizarre. The teleprompter didn't work, and he went off into tangents that suggest serious cognitive decline, including a long soliloquy about whether, coming out of nowhere, if you were on a boat that had a battery on it and you had a shark that came by and the boat sank, would you stick to the battery to be electrocuted, or would you go towards the shark where you might be eaten? And he went on and on about how he discussed this with people at MIT. Now, if Joe Biden did something like that, it would be DEFCON 1 and it would dominate the news, and you will see almost no reflection of it. And that's because our press corps has enormous difficulty doing two things. One is basically moving away from relaying both sides of a story, so we get equivalence. The second is, which is a real dilemma for the press, where you have abnormal behavior and you're used to treating it as normal. And what we're seeing is a normalization of the abnormal and an unwillingness, because you're afraid of being accused of bias, of reporting the real dangers that exist here. And when it comes to an election, it is so easy to fall back on the horse race coverage that has always been the mainstay of covering elections. And you pay money for polls, so doing the polls and showing where we are on that basis, instead of looking at the stakes of what this election is. And it's particularly disturbing to me because Trump continues to refer to our press as the enemy of the people. Now, we know the enemy of the people is a slogan that was originated by Stalin as an excuse to round up and murder his opponents and a whole lot of others. And that when Nikita Khrushchev became the leader in the Soviet Union, he abolished or banned the use of the term the enemy of the people because it was too incendiary. And now it's back. And we're sleepwalking towards the possibility of an autocracy. And we're sleepwalking as well towards another reality, which is we have a deeply divided society. It is polarized, it is true, but lots of societies, and our system in the past has been polarized, and that doesn't mean you can't, if people abide by fundamental norms in the system, govern and get by. You can be polarized, but still share a common belief that we've got problems as a society and we have to find ways to work together to solve them. I've been around the political system here in Congress for 55 years now. And within the system, knew most of the major players. I had friendships with Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy. Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy were dear friends. It was one of the oddest couples you will ever see. Completely different lifestyles and viewpoints. But they built this bond of friendship, and they decided together that we had a big problem, which was children didn't have health insurance. So they were going to create a way to provide health insurance for children. The CHIPS Act is still in effect. There are at least 9 million kids who have health insurance as a result of it. And what they did was they said, we got a problem here. Let's see where we can find a common core of things that we can agree on. And then with the others, we'll do some horse trading, we'll do some compromising. And then when we put something together, when we go to the floor, we'll have a united front and make sure that poison pill amendments don't blow it up. Now, we don't get anything like that anymore. And that's because we're not just polarized, we are tribalized. The tribalization really began, I would argue, when Newt Gingrich came to Congress in January of 79, excuse me. And it was a deliberate attempt to tribalize our politics. And that was accelerated by the rise of tribal media, which really began a couple of years after that. And it began when the Federal Communications Commission got rid of the fairness doctrine. Now, I'm not going to suggest to you that we could possibly have a fairness doctrine back anyhow now with the nature of media and social media. But when it happened, Rush Limbaugh, who had been a noontime talk show host in Sacramento, saw that he could go national, move to New York, and that created tribal media. And what started with Newt in Washington metastasized out to the states, and we see it now almost everywhere, and then to the public as a whole. And we are a tribalized society. Donald Trump didn't create this. He has been a catalyst of taking it to the next level. The fact is, if Trump disappeared, we are still going to have enormous challenges as a society. And they won't necessarily be the same challenges that could lead us into a really vicious autocracy. But we know that we have a political system in its structure that is increasingly leading us away from the legitimacy of the political system. One thing I will say on that front is we're almost at a point now where 70% of Americans live in just 15 of our 50 states. 50% of Americans live in just 8 states. Now, we know why that's happening. It's because people move to states where in a global economy, you have jobs and you have the ability to survive and thrive. And it's not that they're all the big ones are all blue states and the red ones, the little ones are all red states. We have Delaware, we have Maine on the one front, we have Texas, we have Florida on the other. But we're going to end up with a electoral college, which increasingly is going to make it possible, if we continue to have elections, that somebody could win the popular vote by 7, 8, 9, 10 million and still lose the presidency. And the more times that happens, the more people believe that there's no legitimacy to the system. You get the rejoinder, we're a republic, not a democracy. What is a republic? A republic is where voters elect representatives who represent them. And if you're voting and you're not getting represented, you're going to question the legitimacy of the system. More significantly, if 70% of Americans live in 15 states, 30% of Americans will elect 70 of 100 US senators. And that 30%, again, they're not going to be all Republicans, all red, but they don't represent the economic vibrancy of the country, much less the diversity of the society. And increasingly, what's going to happen is that they are going to demand more resources coming from the prosperous states to cover up for the issues that they have in those states. And again, you're going to be voting, but it's not going to be reflected in representation. You put that together with gerrymandering, and now we have not just partisan gerrymandering, but racial gerrymandering given a green light by the Supreme Court. And we now have basically blown up both Section 2 and Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, the ones that provide those fundamental protections. And the House does not reflect in any way what the framers anticipated, which is the House of all bodies would be representative of us and would reflect the passions of the country. You know, one good example, we know now that the vast majority of Americans want some kind of immigration reform. The House isn't going to take it up. 90% consistently want background checks on guns. Nothing happens. Climate change, all of these issues are not being dealt with in a fashion that reflects public views or even public passions, because you have people who are insulated from those larger views. So all of that means we'll have challenges even if Trump doesn't prevail. But what we also know is that the direct threat is a much bigger one right now. Now, if you look around the world and look at dictators, in most instances where they've come in through some form of election, they sugarcoat what they're going to do. They downplay. They talk about how they're going to fit within the system and they get support on that basis. Donald Trump isn't like that. He may lie about all kinds of things, including this week saying, I'm the one who brought $35 insulin, not Joe Biden, which is just wrong. But in this, he's been brutally honest. He says that he will pardon the January 6th rioters because they are held hostage now, and they were the heroes of this, and the Capitol Police lured them in as part of a sting operation. He has said that he will create a process to deport 12 million, as he calls them, illegals. And the people around him, the ones who are closest to him, have talked about the plans that they have to create camps, detention facilities. We used to call them concentration camps, to gather them up, round them up before they get deported. He has said he will invoke the Insurrection Act if he's elected, and he has said directly that he will fire the generals who would not allow him to use the military to deal with domestic protests. And here you can fault all of those people on both sides of the aisle who knew that this act, which goes back a very long time, shouldn't be there in this form. It's all based on the assumption that you have a president who will use it only for legitimate purposes and did nothing to try and amend it or repeal it. But it's not that he would necessarily need to use the law anyhow. And we know that we have a foreign policy where his top advisor, who is designated to go around the world to talk about what he would do, Rick Grinnell, has basically said that they would blow up NATO, that they would give a green light to Putin after that to do what he wanted for these countries that weren't ponying up money in their fair share, that he would basically create an alliance with the dictators in the world and with his friends, Putin, Kim Jong-un, Bill, and others, along with having much greater, vaster tariffs to deal with economic policy based on the bizarre assumption that that's money that's paid by the foreign countries and not paid by consumers when goods come in and have higher prices. And we know that his closest advisors are working hand in glove with the Heritage Foundation on Project 2025. And he has said directly that he would purge the bureaucracy by bringing back Schedule F, which would enable him to take career bureaucrats and fire them. And it's not necessarily that he would fire 1 million people. He would fire 1,000 people and the signal would go to everybody else. You want to keep your jobs, you're going to do what I tell you to do. He would abolish the departments of education and commerce. He would purge the FBI of traitors. And then, of course, there's the social agenda, which includes not just cracking down even further on abortion, but going after contraception, going after gay marriage. And then they've talked directly about repealing Supreme Court verdicts that or decisions that decriminalized gay sex. And of course, they've also talked about trying to do things that would bring penalties to premarital sex as well. Now, whether they could accomplish all those things, I'm not sure. What I do know is that we face two prospects if Donald Trump wins and has a ply in Congress, and he will have a ply in court. And one is what we know has become a role model for many on the right, and Trump has also talked favorably about him, and that's Viktor Orban. The model in Hungary is that you have the structure of a democracy, but it's a Potemkin village. It is on its surface and face an independent judiciary, but it's a judiciary that would do nothing that would challenge the power or actions of the president. That you have elections that on the surface are fair, but that are rigged so that there is no possibility that you could lose. That you have the semblance of a free press, but every time one of the electronic communications outlets in Hungary or newspapers or magazines criticized Orban, all of a sudden they were faced with crushing tax bills or with some of their executives arrested on trumped up charges, and they either go out of business or they stop doing what they've been doing. We know that CPAC, the Congressional Political Action Committee, which has been the sort of organization that almost all aspiring presidential candidates and other major figures in the Republican Party go to their conferences, that they have done it twice. The most recent one was in Hungary, where they gave awards to Viktor Orban. We just saw yesterday J.D. Vance, the senator from Ohio, talk about how great Orban was and what wonderful things he's done in Hungary. So that's one possibility, maybe the most significant one where our institutions in theory are holding, but actually they're not. But the other would be more of the model of a Vladimir Putin, which is a much more punitive and vicious operation, one where violence is used or threatened to keep people in check, and of course one where as we've seen with almost all of these autocracies, the family and the friends of the leader make out like bandits, because they are bandits taking billions and enriching themselves. Now I'd say one more thing here, which is the other place where you might look for support to keep us from moving in that direction is the business community. The business community, the financial community are doing just what we saw in Germany in the 1930s. And that is basically downplaying the problems or basically suggesting that as long as their tax rates are low and regulations are kept away from them, they're fine with whatever goes on. That was true even with many in Silicon Valley, as Trump was there more recently. And we've seen it with our billionaires like Steve Schwarzman, David Sachs, and Bill Ackman, moving towards accepting, even embracing Donald Trump. So we have to start to think through what the consequences are here. We cannot take anything for granted anymore. We cannot expect just because we hope and wish that the system will hold that it will. We're facing an existential crisis right now, but even if that existential crisis doesn't come to pass, because of the structural problems and the cultural issues that we face with a tribalized society, we're going to have rough times in this country for years to come. We're going to have to find our way out of it within, one hopes, both the rule of law and the fundamental decency that has to be restored in the kind of dialogue that we have in the society. So have a nice evening.
Okay, we have a nice evening now.
Like Orban lost 8% in the election.
Well, just wondered, anyone who wants to do away with themselves right now, could they please go outside? Those who want to ask questions, please raise your hands and indicate, and we'll take questions. Normal take questions.
Well, do you have any theories about Roberts? I mean, Roberts is not a radical guy, as far as I can tell you. And he said the DC Circuit decision was junk. I remember, I didn't reread it after he said that, but I thought I remembered it being pretty good, and he won't take any action against these guys.
So here's a little story about John Roberts. back in 1999, I got a call from George Mitchell, who asked me to come into his law firm. And I went in with Tom Mann, and Bob Dole was also there. They were both in the same law firm at the time. And George said, the independent counsel statute is going to expire next year. And that was the one, of course, that it had Ken Starr and many others. And George said, somebody, I won't give you the name, contacted me and said, we shouldn't let it be renewed. Obviously, it's had all kinds of abuses, but we can't leave it with nothing in place. You have to have some ability to have an independent way when there are allegations of misconduct or criminal behavior with people at the top of the society. So Mitchell and Dole asked the two of us to do a major study with and come up with recommendations for an alternative to the independent counsel statute. We set out to do this, and the first thing we did was we brought in somebody named Mike Davidson, who'd been the counsel to the Senate. We brought in a couple of bright lawyers, and we spent months looking at what the other states have done, what other countries have done. And then we got 8 people to sit down for 3 days intensively to go through almost like a markup session and come up with an alternative. And the 8 people we had included Dick Thornburg, former Attorney General, former Governor of Pennsylvania, Drew Days, the former Solicitor General, Carla Hills, who had been a cabinet officer and also had been in the Justice Department, Zoe Baird, and Mark Toohey, who had been an independent counsel, and John Roberts, who was then at his law firm. And he was incredibly impressive in these 3 days. So smart, obviously very conservative, but very constructive. And what we came up with was, we don't want another law, which would be a little too constraining and would be difficult to do. We want to recommend a series of regulations that the Justice Department could implement and promulgate that would create the appropriate checks and balances here. And unanimously, the 8 signed off on it, as did Mitchell and Dole. And that really became the basis for what the Justice Department did to create a process that had Bob Mueller, Jack Smith, Bob Hur, David Weiss, and others. That's now under challenge. And we'll see if it gets to the Supreme Court, whether what John Roberts agreed to is something that he will continue to agree to. But after that, when he got nominated to be Chief Justice, I wrote something supporting him because I thought that he was a serious, balanced figure. But frankly, what we know is that his confirmation hearing, he lied. He said, I want to move from 5-4 decisions in a divided court to 8-1 or 9-0 decisions. And we do that by deciding cases on the narrowest basis possible. And we respect stare decisis. And that's how we can all come together. And within months, we had Citizens United, which was brought as a very narrow, as applied case. And Roberts, pushed by other justices, it's true, including Anthony Kennedy, instead decided to broaden it to take into account 100 years of campaign finance law that had nothing to do with the original case and had never been argued and had not been brought by the plaintiffs in the case. And we got Citizens United as a consequence. And then we got Shelby County and the Voting Rights Act, in which he gave all kinds of reasons as to why it was no longer necessary to have a Voting Rights Act in place that had been approved unanimously in one body and nearly unanimously in the other, and blew up the Voting Rights Act. And everything that's happened since, including evidence that completely contradicts what he believed in, he's doubled down even further. Now we have all of these cases involving ethical issues. Roberts deliberately resisted and pushed back against any attempt to create a code of ethics that would apply to the Supreme Court. And then they did a sham code that actually opens the door to more stuff and has said nothing. So I'm no longer a great fan of John Roberts. And I'm sure it pains him that the Roberts court is now, under siege, that he is, very possibly, the legacy of that court is going to be a very stained one, but he does not appear able to do anything much, about it. And I'm not sure why. I think at this point, the problem is that even if he wanted to create some kind of middle ground, he has 5 others who will not allow that to happen. But it's Robert's.
He tried the abortion, he didn't work very.
Yeah, well, it's Robert's court that leads me to be very uneasy about whether or not it will hold if and when we face these challenges. Yeah.
So, do you see any light in this darkness? I mean, maybe Wisconsin is the light. What's happening?
Yeah, I would say that one, we have a lot of states that are stepping up and trying to do the right thing. That we have some very courageous opinion leaders. And, it includes Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, but it also includes people like Bill Kristol and Joe Walsh and others who are deeply engaged with the Republican Party over the last several decades, who now have said, this is wrong, we can't allow this to continue, who want to restore a Republican Party to being a problem-solving party and not what it is, which is now frankly a cult, which would be a very conservative party, would be a party with Liz Cheney's policy views. That's fine. We can tolerate polarized politics if we have 2 legitimate parties. So that's a good thing. There are journalists who are doing the right thing and are pushing to do the right thing. I mean, frankly, what's happened, John and I were talking a little earlier about the Washington Post, is very troubling on the other front, but we've got a lot of very good journalists. We have the fact that at least we had 1 trial of Donald Trump, and he got convicted by a jury of his peers, and the judge handled it, I would say, close to impeccably, even though he's gotten a lot of pressure. And the jurors, even though they faced the possibility of being outed and harassed or worse, did what you would hope a jury would do. And the jury system is still something to be admired, I think. We have now, of course, Hunter Biden on trial, and that's probably going to, it may have gone to the jury tonight, I'm not sure. And we are, I suspect, going to get a decision fairly soon on that one. And we have a president who said, I love my son, but I'm not going to interfere in this. I will not pardon him. If the decision comes down, I'll respect the rule of law. And one would hope that we would see more of that resonating throughout the society. So there are some reasons to be less pessimistic. We have a lot of people mobilizing for this election, understanding the stakes, putting in money, time, and effort to try and keep it from heading in the worst possible direction. And if you look at the, we're still getting primaries on the Republican side, even though the nomination has been decided. But even in the last few, you're getting between 10 and 22% of Republican voters who are voting for Nikki Haley or voting for somebody else, suggesting that they're not comfortable with the direction that things are going. Whether that pans out in votes remains to be seen. We're also seeing some pushback against the aftermath of the Dobbs decision, and at least some attempt to try and deal with some of the deeply divisive problems in the society. And we all have to play our part in that as well, as much as what individuals can do. And I think we're also seeing an awful lot of people who are concerned about the threats to democracy, including those, the Ann Applebaums and Tim Snyders of the world, who have seen the arc in other societies of what happens when you lose your democracy. And frankly, we also have the reality that 90% of those who are in Trump's cabinet have refused to endorse him, have said It was much worse inside than you think it was, and it would be 100 times worse after that. And there's some courage attached to all of that. And that includes some military leaders, of course, as well. It includes his chief of staff, John Kelly, and of course, many who served, others who served in the White House. So, you know, it's not all darkness. And I wouldn't say that, you know, polls are not terribly meaningful right now as a general matter. One, the whole polling world has been in crisis for some time. Response rates are down to about 3%. Most of the polls are just not very good to begin with. And even the aggregates include a lot of bad polls. Having said that, we know it's close. It's deeply troubling that it would be this close. But what we also know is that most voters have paid almost no attention to what's going on because people live their lives. This just doesn't dominate for them, and they've got their own issues to deal with. The closer you get to election, the more people start to pay attention. And as they start to pay attention, some of them are going to begin to see the pathologies that Donald Trump represents. And some of them are going to start to see what he has promised to do if he gets elected again. And that may make a difference in the places that matter, which is 7 or 8 states and that are going to be close and at the margins. So, you know, it's not all bad, but frankly, it's far from good. Yeah. Blair, then.
Keeping on the theme of whiteness, so your populace. One of the things that curious me is I have no idea what a second body. Can you speculate on?
Yeah.
I assume just for the sake of argument, then take the House, Republicans.
Yeah.
I have a related question.
Yeah.
That maybe you can put all together.
Yes.
What's gonna happen when Biden wins? How is Trump gonna react? What's gonna happen? How is Biden gonna handle that, which goes along with Blair's question?
We have to face the possibility that we could have some violence. What I would worry about as much as anything is there's a possibility that Biden wins by winning Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and say one district in Nebraska, and gets exactly 270 electoral votes, losing Nevada, Arizona, Georgia. That's possible. Then you're going to have a much bigger headache. There will be resistance. There will be, you know, another drumbeat that the election was stolen. That's something to worry about. But let's say that it is a victory like the last time, one where the electoral vote margin is a substantial one, even with some close states, and that those states are handle their elections in a fair fashion. And, you know, another piece of good news is, just as an example, Stephen Richer, who is the top election official in Maricopa County, Arizona, Republican, was just endorsed by former Governor Ducey, and Arizona is going to have a fair election. And I think we're going to see that in most of these states. They're going to be able to handle it. Other states, not so much. But as you say, Blair, it's more likely than not under those circumstances that Democrats recapture the House and Republicans take the Senate. And we're going to have a rough 2 years at least, or maybe more, because the Senate is going to have the capacity to block not just any judicial nominations that a second Biden term would bring up, but also would wreak havoc with his executive nominations and make it very difficult for him to govern. And frankly, the Supreme Court, as it is constituted, is likely to undercut him further. We're still waiting decisions on the Chevron doctrine and on the administrative state. And it is very, very likely that we have at least 5 votes, and very possibly 6, to deeply curtail the ability of executive agencies to act. And that means that the ability to do anything on climate, on immigration, on most of the areas that are of real difficulty in the society, we'll get nowhere with it. It's based on the assumption that you can't take any action as an administrative agency unless Congress has explicitly called for it. And that includes, we know from a decision involving EPA. If you have a new pollutant that emerges and you try to deal with it, or in the case of the CDC, if you have a new virus and it hasn't been explicitly included in legislation, you aren't able to take the broad public health measures that you would normally take. And Congress, even under the best of circumstances, can't anticipate what's going to happen in the world. We'll have havoc. So is it better? Will there still be some ability for a president to act? Probably yes. If we are in that circumstance, at least the midterm elections are not as likely to result in the usual pattern of the president's party losing seats. We very likely will be able to recapture the Senate. The Republicans continue to put up pretty bad nominees. But, you know, remember, this is a Senate that is basically going to be without most of those people who might be willing to go along. And even there, you know, one of the things that I found discouraging. So we have this case in New York, and frankly, it's a more serious case than a lot of people gave it credit for. If you go back to the 2016 campaign, the Access Hollywood tape comes out, and every major Republican figure and most minor figures immediately condemned Trump in the strongest terms. And if days or weeks later, we had learned that along with that tape, he had had a long-time affair with a Playboy model while his wife was pregnant with Barron. And then, right after Barron was born, had sex with a porn star. That would have been the end of his campaign. They would have forced him out. It would have been disastrous for him. All of this was an attempt to keep that from happening and to alter the results of the election. So it's a serious case. And if you followed it at all, the Judge Merchan bent over backwards. Even today, bent over backwards for Trump. He had to meet with his probation officer, which every convicted person does. The pattern is you have to go in physically, you have to do a drug test, a urine test, you have to meet face to face with the probation officer. They let him do it from Mar-a-Lago on Zoom without a drug test. So they bent over backwards. Now, I mention all of that because among those who condemned the case, condemned the judge, condemned the jury, was Susan Collins, one of the first statements made. And it lied about what had happened in the case. And that tells me something. It tells me that you can't count on any currently in office to provide some sort of safety net against a Congress that would be pliant to his demands. And that's a Republican Senate that would still have Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski. And Lisa Murkowski has, you know, repeatedly said, I don't know what's happened to my party, where are these people coming from? But she's still there and doesn't show any signs of creating a fifth column, as it were. Yeah.
So, what do you thought about the filibuster? The filibuster, and whether that could be.
If I would say that I have for a very long time pushed for a filibuster reform. I testified in front of the Senate Rules Committee along with Walter Mondale in 2011. And my idea at that point was you don't get rid of the filibuster, you in fact restore it. And restoring it means you bring it back to what it was supposed to be, which is the burden is on the minority, which feels so strongly, and usually it wasn't a partisan minority, about something that they will go to any lengths to block something from happening and to highlight the issue and to get a debate on it. And then they'll either succeed or fail once they enlighten the public as to why this would be a bad thing to do. And what the filibuster has become is a burden for the majority. You got to have 60 votes or forget it. And you don't bring it just in the most serious issues. You bring it with everything as a weapon of mass obstruction. So the idea was instead of having 60 senators required to end debate, you would need 41 senators required to continue debate. then you can go round the clock and you can put pressure on them. And they're not going to do it unless it's something because they don't want to discomfort their lives and have to spend weekends and evenings in the Senate on cots and the like. That's still something that I would like to see happen. I will tell you that I discussed it multiple times with Joe Manchin, who said this sounds great, and then, of course, disappeared as he always did whenever the time came. We're not going to get, if the best case happens and Democrats somehow hold on to the Senate and win the House and Joe Biden wins, which is extremely unlikely, you're probably going to need 53, 54, 55 Democrats before they'd be willing to do anything about the filibuster. I will tell you that if Trump won and Republicans took the House and Senate and Democrats filibustered things, they would do away with the filibuster in a nanosecond, despite everything that they have said, as they did away with the blue slip when it discomforted them. But, we're going to face that problem of an inability to act. And again, I'll come back to the reality that the Senate is becoming increasingly detached from voters and from the majority of voters in the country. So imagine if you need 60 senators to overcome a filibuster and you have 70 senators who don't represent the majority of the country, you're going to have real trouble getting any action done to solve the problems in the country. And, one other thing that's very worrisome to me is you look at the most recent couple of generations. For us, we had plenty of times when we grew up where government worked, where the society worked, where government and the private sector worked together, and we were able to solve problems, and we could look towards prosperity, and we could think that we would be better off and our kids would be better off. These generations have seen none of that. It's been a constant conflict and a widespread sense. Doesn't matter what the reasons are. You don't offer excuses. It's not working. And I have a great fear that the threat of an autocracy just will not faze them. That it's not working, throw them out. Anything else might work. And because in part we have a press corps that normalizes this stuff, the sense that there is a danger, what I've been talking about here, is not going to be there for a lot of people. They won't see what the consequences are of actions that they take now. And we're going to have great difficulty getting some level of respect for or veneration for democracy, which is a messy process and moves slowly. And often it's one step forward, a half step back, or one step forward and a step and a half back. But it's the way you want a political system to operate. Or even if you have somebody who's more benign as the would-be dictator, the next one won't be. If we don't find a better way of educating and talking to our younger generations, we may find ourselves in a difficult place, even if we skate through this period now.
You're right.
Yeah,
Question about the Senate in Maryland.
yeah.
Larry Hogan is a good Republican candidate, not a whack job. He's advertising himself as an independent. Neither the Democrats nor the Republicans can count on my vote. But the Democrats can't afford to have him in the Senate as a Republican.
Yeah.
To
So
give the Republicans the majority.
and I am he is obviously the best possible candidate that Republicans could have in Maryland. He was popular as a governor. I knew his father a little bit. He was a stand-up guy, basically. I believe that Hogan, in his moderation as governor, was done for pragmatic reasons. He faced a legislature where he was either going to veto everything that they did and end up with vetoes being overridden or with gridlock, or he was going to find ways to work with them and accommodate them. But what we also know is that the favorable buzz about him, even as he left office, ignored some other warning signs. That includes, of course, vetoing a bill that would have protected women's health care in Maryland. And it included blocking the expansion of the metro in ways that would have benefited a lot of Marylanders. But what we also know is when he now says, oh, I'm all for a woman's right to choose and I'll be there in the middle. The reality is if you elect Larry Hogan, you're electing Mike Lee and J.D. Vance and Ron Johnson and Marsha Blackburn. And you're not going to vote against them. But even if you do, it's not going to make the difference. You're going to give them the traction, the ability to do some very bad things. So the real question is whether Angela Alsobrooks can make that case and whether the Democratic Party will pour in the resources to make that case. I think it's still less likely that he will win. But obviously, any other Republican candidate, we wouldn't even be spending a nanosecond talking about Maryland.
And on that story, Maryland being in the presidential race being solidly blue, what can we do to affect things in the 7 or 8 states that are going to call the election?
So, I mean, one thing is there are House seats in Virginia, for example, that are in question and, you know, that may affect the majority there. Help out, maybe even go and canvass a little bit where it will matter. But it also means giving money to places where those elections matter.
Where's the most effective place to give money in a presidential swing state? Is it to one of the committees or?
I would say,
the Biden campaign?
yeah, I would say if you're looking at having an impact in the presidential campaign, I would focus more on Nevada and Georgia and Arizona, because I think those are a little more problematic now than the other ones. But also there's so much money that's going to have to go into the big states that, you know, the marginal impact will be less. And I'd probably give it to the campaign, to the Biden campaign. I, for a long time, didn't give money because I was commenting on these things. Now I give money and boy, it's like no good deed goes unpunished. Already tonight, my phone is buzzed 3 times. I will guarantee you those are 3 calls coming in from candidates and they share your information widely. I'm getting calls from candidates for the Supreme Court in Michigan, for local offices. I mean, it's bizarre, but I prefer to give to the individual candidates rather than say the congressional campaign committees, which I don't necessarily trust as much. It's also worth thinking about if you want to look for places to help, to give to some of the groups that are really trying hard to protect elections and protect democracy. So the group Protect Democracy is one. I've been a long time, I was one of the incorporators of the Campaign Legal Center it was 2002. 22 years ago. I've been on its board ever since, and I chaired it for a number of years. Campaign Legal Center is involved in litigation and other activities all around the country. There are other places that are very good.
Do you have any feelings about, I think it's called 314 Action, which tries to elect scientists and doctors?
Yeah, and you know, everything that I can see is it's a perfectly fine organization. But, you know, right now it's really individual candidates that matter.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you if the Democrats.
And you are?
I'm George Soros. I used to be in the,
Yeah.
not Soros, what is it, Santos. I used to be in Congress.
Yeah.
But I've changed my face and everything,
Yeah.
so now I'm here, changing my party as a Democrat all the way. This is my question. What are your thoughts about the Democrats, and particularly the Biden administration, using the most powerful weapon that they have? And Jen Psaki finally did it on her show, I think last week. And that is, don't have Democrats talk about Democrats. Have the Democrats talk about these Republicans. I mean, when you listen to Haley, what's her name? I forget it already. Haley, not Barbara. You know, what, the woman who ran for against Trump.
Nikki.
Yeah.
I knew it was you, mate.
Yeah.
But anyway, I mean, when you listen to what she was saying, when you listen to what, what's his name, Cruz was saying, you listen to all the, Graham, you know, all these people, and she did it. She said, let's just put it out there. And then people say, well, you have to be careful with this. Why? You go to these swing states and you say, this is what the Republicans are saying about this guy that you may want to vote for. And I have a feeling when a lot of people get behind that curtain, no matter what they've said up front, they're going to pull the ticket for Biden, because this man, to call him a disgrace would be giving him a compliment, he doesn't.
So I have very strongly urged the Biden White House to do a big summit on democracy. And I want to showcase first all the Republican figures who are in the Trump administration. You bring in Mark Milley, you bring in cabinet people, because they have credibility now in talking about Trump. And then you bring in the historians and others who have real credibility in this area, like Tim Snyder and Ann Applebaum and others. And you have Democrats, and you use that as a springboard. The big weapon is the bully pulpit. And we need to have need to have Biden get out there more. I wanted Biden to go to Tennessee when this woman who had an ectopic pregnancy had to go to 3 hospitals before somebody would treat her with a fetus that was already dead and where her life was threatened. And let Governor Bill Lee in Tennessee condemn you, but personalize these issues, because if you just talk in the abstract, it doesn't make the same sense. And I agree with you. When I saw Paul Begala, who I like and generally admire, say, no, we should downplay this stuff, it's too dangerous, I think that's absolutely wrong. I think you're right. Because the reality is the presidential election is going to be decided in 7 states, maybe 8. I'm a little worried about my native Minnesota, but those 7 states, and it's going to be decided at the margins by 2 groups of people. One is the Democratic base, and there we do have a problem. We got to get them energized, and they're not at this point. And I am more worried, frankly, about Cornel West and Jill Stein and RFK Jr. The former 2 are tilting way in a pro-Palestinian direction to try and lure over the Arab American voters in Michigan, but also young progressives who are disillusioned. But talking about what Republicans would do is going to get some of those voters energized, but even more, it's the suburban college educated Republicans and independents who will matter at the margins. And I think the combination of Trump's conviction, of Trump's plans, of the aftermath of the Dobbs decision is going to have an impact there if you can pound away and make it clear that this is a bad thing to do and that a vote for anybody else is a vote for Trump. So I'm with you on this. Yeah.
Do you think that Colin already can beat Ted Cruz?
I know Colin pretty well. He is a really good guy, an impressive guy. This is a man who was a pro football lineman before going into politics. He is smart, he's attractive, he's articulate and strong and good, but this is Texas. And even though he is really good and Ted Cruz is monstrous, and you'll remember what Al Franken said about Ted Cruz when Al was in the Senate, that I like Ted Cruz more than my Republican colleagues do, and I hate Ted Cruz. But this is Texas, and Texas has elected some of the most monstrous figures in American civil society. The Attorney General Ken Paxton is a disgusting human being and a criminal. The governor, Greg Abbott, is horrible, and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick may be even worse. But they also have had the ability to alter the election system there. Harris County is the most populous county in Texas. It is, I think, the size of Maryland. And they're gonna have one drop box for the entire county. People who have to travel more than 100 miles if they want to do an absentee ballot. They're gonna harass voters. But it's also a state that is maybe making a transition towards a purple state. It may be seductive that you can get close. I'm hoping that there'll be enough of a backlash as we move further on that suddenly we see something very different. But remember that one of the challenges that Democrats have is a very substantial number of Hispanic voters are not moved by the immigration issue because they're citizens. In the Rio Grande Valley, they've been there for 150 years. They don't view the ones coming in over the border as kindred spirits. They view them as aliens. They're conservative socially, and they don't see the Democratic Party as being for them. And so it's a real uphill battle in Texas. And the tribalism, I look at, just to pick another example, Montana used to be a state that could elect Democrats. I had a very close relationship with Lee Metcalf, who was a Democratic senator there for a long time. They had a popular and competent Democratic governor who ran for the Senate against a right-wing extremist. And the Republican won handily because it's tribal now. They vote their tribal identity. And so Texas, I don't think, is at a place yet where, I would support Colin. I'd like to give him the chance. Maybe it'll work out. The fact is, the only two states where Republicans have senators that could flip are Texas and Florida. And, Florida ought to be a good one too. Rick Scott is really bad and not popular. But that state has moved from competitive to more red as well.
They probably have 4 or 5 messages a day from Colorado Red's campaign.
Yeah.
It's like amazing to me. If I look at it, it's another one.
Yep. And if you give them some money, you'll get 6 or 7 messages.
The worst problem that Democrats have is Biden. Biden's aging, weak appearance. His mind is still working, but his body's not. And this is the greatest problem that the Democrats have, and they have no ability to change the candidate. The only thing I can see as a physician is to give him some medicine.
Well, Trump has said it'll be very interesting to see if Trump actually shows up at the debate in 2 weeks. And he's already given some indications that he's going to find a way to back out. One is he's demanding that Biden take a drug test. Now, having said that, I think the debate is extremely important. And if Biden does badly in the debate, we're in a very, very
And
bad
Trump
place.
does have signs of cognitive deterioration.
Trump has flashing neon signs of cognitive decline. You watch any one of his speeches and it's getting worse. I would tell you that, he continues to say, look at this test that I took. Man, woman, person, camera, TV, I still remember it. So a few months ago, we were in LA and I had an ear infection and I went to the Minute Clinic at a CVS. And they had all my information and they said, well, you're over 70. We're now required to give you this test because we may have to ask you some questions. So I'm going to give you 5 words and then I'll ask you again a little bit later on. It's all about whether you have signs of dementia and you're actually capable of understanding what's going on around you. The question is, but again, it's what I started with. Trump goes off on these tangents and misspeaks and, has issues that are just crying out for he needs help and they don't get covered.
I
They don't get covered at all.
The Shark Union is not supporting Trump because they said, how are we going to eat if people don't fall off the boat?
Well, let's hope he jumped the shark. But, it's Biden is cognitively strong. People whom I trust who are with him in one-on-one sessions or small group sessions say that he is still
That's
very
my
much
impression
there
too,
and with it.
But physically, he looks
yeah.
Parkinsonian.
the Wall Street Journal ran a shameful piece this past week where the only one that they quoted was Kevin McCarthy, who said, oh, he's losing it. He's really losing it. This is the same Kevin McCarthy who a couple of months ago told his friends, hey, I was in the meetings with him. He's sharp as could be. So he was lying. But all of that reinforces this image that you're talking about. We know that Biden misspeaks as he's done since he was much younger because of his stuttering issue. We know that he's had foot problems and back problems, so he stooped over and he stumbles a little bit, so it looks bad. But I think the debate is going to be a critical moment. People see him as being competent and strong. And I do think that actually mattered in the debates in 2020. You know, my wife Judy and my son Danny and I were at the first debate in Cleveland. And it was a trying experience. We got there early, the Cleveland Clinic, for everybody who was going to be, it was only about 60 people in the room. They gave you the full Monty test going all the way down, and then you had to wait for hours to get the results. Everybody had to wear masks. And we know that Trump didn't take the test and it tested positive for COVID. We sat there, everybody separated, while his family and entourage came in wearing masks, sat down, took the masks off. A Cleveland Clinic physician went to them and said, I'm sorry, you have to put the mask back on. And they gave him the middle finger. And people criticized the debate commission. The debate commission had no options. And frankly, what are you going to do when a debate is about to begin? Have a huge brouhaha over the Trump people and basically destroy the debate? They swallowed hard and let it go forward. And Trump, that was most famous for the Proud Boys. They're great people, stand back and stand by. But the fact is that if you watch that debate, you saw calm, cool, collected Joe Biden and an out of control Donald Trump. And I think at the margins that mattered for some voters. So the debates still count.
Something worked at the State of the Union.
Yeah.
When he gave the State of the Union.
And he's, you know, the problem with those who would hope he would just go away is that if Biden had said he wasn't running, we would have had a wide open and rancorous contest for a nomination. And very likely the heir apparent, a woman of color, would have been denied the nomination. And you would have had a real division in the Democratic Party. And we know from experience that a contested primary and a deeply divisive party is far more likely to lose. So this is the hand that we've been dealt, and it's the hand that we're going to have to live with and cope with.
Look at it in Norman, he did a great job. And
Yeah.
and Memorial Day.
Yeah.
And it hardly made the news. You
Well,
don't see that speech on.
No, well, that's, you know, that stuff is not covered. Horse race things are covered. And I am so deeply disappointed in our mainstream media. You know, they're the first ones who will be hauled in and arrested or dealt with harshly.
But even the PBS NewsHour didn't play that speech. They said it had taken place and that was.
Yeah. And, you know, they'll cover more of what Trump has done because just as it was in 2016 and 2020, he gets eyeballs, he gets coverage, but it's the way in which these things are covered. And what disappoints me as much as anything is the framing of this election should be on the stakes of the election. It should not be on who's up, who's down, what the polls tell us. It's really letting voters know, because that's the most important thing, and that's the news, what the stakes are. What happens if Donald Trump wins? What happens if Joe Biden wins? What happens to health policy? What happens to women's health care? And remember, this is not just about abortion. We're seeing OBGYNs leave states where there will be nobody who can deal with the broader questions of women's health. We're seeing emergency rooms that are refusing to treat people because they're afraid. And we're seeing laws, and this is the Texas Supreme Court just ruled that the Texas law, which is deliberately vague, so that physicians or nurses don't know what's covered, but know that the possibility is they could be arrested and imprisoned. So they're not going to do anything, but basically ruled that the vagueness was just fine. All of that, those are stakes that matter. And what happens with the environment? What happens with our alliances and foreign policy? What happens to Ukraine? What happens to Poland? What happens to Taiwan? What happens with the economy if you're going to build a policy around protectionism that's even starker than what we've seen? And if you're going to give more and more tax cuts to the 0.1% and probably end up having a faltering economy as a consequence. But those things barely get covered. It's really disturbing. Yeah.
You paint, and I agree with that, a really dystopian future if Trump is elected. And
Yeah.
the depth of material we have to back it up is huge. Nonetheless, there are going to be tens of millions of people who are going to, no matter what happens, they're going to vote for Trump.
Yeah.
His cronies. Do you think that if they recognize this dystopian future, they would vote against it? Or do you think they're persuaded by something different? A rejection, as you described, of kind of what's going on now. And therefore that may not be as persuasive as it is to us.
So I would say, first, let's start with the Steve Schwartzmans of the world. Okay, this is a man worth $40+ billion. When Barack Obama mused that maybe we should change the tax rate for carried interest, Schwartzman likened it to Hitler invading Poland. And basically, the billionaires who are supporting Trump believe that if he keeps their tax rates low and gives them what they need, that they're protected. They live in gated communities, they have security, nothing will happen to them. That's one group. I mean, I think it's a level of greed that we did see with the business community and rich people in Germany in the 1930s. Now, beyond that, you have a lot of voters in a tribal world. If you have come to believe, so when Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy got together, it was each looking at the other and saying, my God, you're so deeply misguided. Your views are ridiculous and bizarre, but you're an honorable person. You're a good American. We want to work together to solve problems. Now they look at each other and it's you're evil and you're trying to destroy our way of life. And that's moved down to a much broader public. So if you believe that the other side is evil and trying to destroy your way of life, a lot of people who look at Donald Trump and say, what a horrible person. Look at how he's treated his family. Look at the crudeness. But if we criticize him, that's giving aid and comfort to the people who are trying to destroy our way of life. If you look at the bizarreness, it'll take a while before it really begins to take effect. In Florida, in Missouri, in Iowa now, insurance rates have gone through the roof because of climate change and what it's done. And insurers are leaving. And it's the average people who can't afford the insurance who are going to suffer from this. And they're the ones voting for people who deny that there is any problem with climate change, who don't take any of the mitigating actions that might make it easier for people, but they still vote for them. And they vote for them because they're not the evil people who are trying to destroy our way of life. And that's a reality we have to live with, that people are going to vote against, in many cases, their own interests, not just economic interests, but well-being more generally, because we have tribalized. And so you take a state like Iowa that used to be one that voted more often for Democrats for president. Now there isn't a single chance of that happening. That's true in Montana. That's true in Missouri. And it's true in Florida now. And it's a very, very difficult thing to deal with. And then you've got plenty of people who think that, hey, it can't be that bad. You know, it really wasn't that bad when Trump was president. And some of that is cognitive dissonance. And, you know, my response often to that is there are 400,000 people in the graveyards who died of COVID who would like a word with you. But, you know, people forget that and only think about how, gee, it wasn't all that bad. So it's much easier to focus on those things. And you have genuine concerns with Biden, with the state of the world, with the state of the economy. You know, it is, by every objective standard, a remarkable economy. It is doing far better than any of our other industrialized countries who also had to face the aftermath of COVID. But, you know, for the things that matter, prices are higher. And of course, it's also human nature. You know, when gas goes to $4.50 a gallon, people scream. When it comes down to $2.80, they don't say, oh boy, that's wonderful. They just go on. So, you know, there are reasons why people might want to change and why they don't understand what the consequences are of the change that we would face, that it's not the usual, where we're going to see, you know, move from, say, somewhere around the center left to somewhere around the center right. So it's very worrisome. The idea that this guy could win election again, especially given what he said he would do, is bizarre. And I have to tell you that, you know, Hispanic voters, who are Americans, who either were born here or who came here and got citizenship, when they start to round up 12 million people and they're given license to pick up anybody who you think might be undocumented, plenty of those people who vote for him are going to end up being hauled in and treated badly and saying, hey, that's not what you were supposed to do. It wasn't me, it was them. So people will suffer in the aftermath of it, but that's not good enough.
On which you're politically though,
Yes.
I think an hour and a half, we said an hour and a half.
Yeah.
You exceeded our expectations. in every way.
Thank you. Stay tuned for the next town talk next fall.